I remember the day I left Ohio. The crisp Navy uniform, starched and perfectly fitted, felt less like government-issued clothing and more like a suit of gleaming armor against the oppressive, humid air of the suburban cul-de-sac. It was late August, the kind of sticky, heavy heat that made the asphalt shimmer and magnified the suburban silence. I wasn't running away, not exactly, but joining the military had become the most effective escape route I could devise from the suffocating atmosphere of my own home. My father was there, standing awkwardly by the driveway next to my heavy duffel bag. His pride was a quiet, almost imperceptible thing, a flicker in his eyes that he rarely allowed to surface, especially not when Carol was within earshot. He clapped me once on the shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more affection and approval than 1,000 of his strained, mumbled conversations ever could. But Carol, my stepmother, she didn't bother with subtlety. She stood framed in the doorway, her arms crossed over her impeccably tailored linen dress, observing the scene with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist watching an experiment conclude. For her, my enlistment wasn't a patriotic choice or a professional opportunity. It was a personal victory. I saw the palpable relief in her eyes, the profound, satisfying relief of finally getting rid of the black sheep, the inconvenient truth, the piece of the puzzle that simply refused to fit into her perfectly manicured life plan. I was the outlier, the one who didn't care about the HOA rules, the one who spoke my mind, and crucially, the one who saw through her polished veneer. Carol operated on appearances and financial leverage. Everything in her life, from the expensive landscaping to the brand of sparkling water she insisted on serving, was a calculated performance designed to impress the neighbors and elevate her social standing. I, with my practical nature and my disdain for superficiality, was a constant, irritating smudge on her flawless domestic canvas. The air inside the house was always thick with her passive-aggressive shade, a constant low-level hum of disapproval directed primarily at me, but increasingly at the only person who offered me sanctuary, Grandma Eleanor. Eleanor was my constant, the soft, unwavering light in the house that Carol tried desperately, ceaselessly to extinguish. Eleanor wasn't just my grandmother. She was my confidant, my mentor, and the silent co-conspirator in my survival within that emotional desert. I felt the weight of the promise. It was a lifeline, not just for her, but for me. It was a commitment to maintain the only authentic connection I had left in Ohio. She stepped back, giving me a long, searching look. Go find your purpose, my girl. Go be safe. And remember what I taught you about keeping your own counsel. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I climbed into the taxi I'd secretly arranged, desperate to avoid the awkwardness of a family send-off. As the car pulled away, I watched her in the rearview mirror, a small, resolute figure standing alone on the porch, waving until the corner swallowed us up. Carol was nowhere in sight. She had already moved on, already calculating the benefits of my absence. The drive to the processing center, and eventually to the port where I would board my first ship, was a blur of nervous energy and focused determination. When I finally stood on the deck, the rigid structure of the ship felt surprisingly comforting. It was a world of black and white, right and wrong, duty and consequence. A welcome change from the gray, manipulative landscape I had just abandoned. Watching the Ohio coastline shrink into an indistinct haze, I felt a deep ache of separation, a raw, exposed nerve where Eleanor's love resided. But beneath the sadness was the resolute certainty that I was doing the right thing for Meow. I was trading domestic suffocation for global service. The military wasn't just a job. It was a sanctuary carved out of discipline and distance. My focus immediately snapped to my duty. The endless drills, the demanding physical training, the complex machinery of the ship that required absolute attention. I thrived on the structure. It was the antidote to Carol's chaos. But even as I dedicated myself fully to my new life, my heart remained anchored back in the suburbs of Ohio, specifically with Eleanor. I knew with a certainty that chilled me despite the tropical deployment zones, that my absence had opened a dangerous door. Carol's long-held desire, cutting Eleanor out of our lives completely, was no longer just a wish. It was an opportunity. I was now thousands of miles away, serving my country, but simultaneously haunted by the growing fear that the person I loved most was now completely exposed to the shadow I had just escaped. I prayed that my weekly letters would be enough to keep the light burning for both of us. The distance was my freedom, but it was also my greatest vulnerability. I had worn my uniform as armor, but I realized too late that I had left my true anchor unprotected. The anxiety began to settle in my chest, heavy and constant, like a low-grade fever I couldn't shake. I was dedicated to my service, but a part of me was already fighting a battle I couldn't see, a battle Carol was waging back home. The sea became my horizon, a vast, undulating gray that swallowed the memory of Ohio suburbia whole. Life aboard the ship was a relentless, grinding machine, demanding every ounce of my attention and energy. I thrived on the structure. The Navy didn't care about my stepmother's passive-aggressive manipulations or my father's quiet resignation. It only cared about my efficiency, my loyalty to the mission, and my ability to execute orders precisely. I found a profound, unexpected solace in that unforgiving clarity. My days blurred into a cycle of watches, drills, maintenance checks, and the constant hum of powerful engines beneath the deck plates. The air smelled perpetually of diesel, salt, and stale coffee. My uniform, no longer just a suit of armor, was a second skin, a badge of purpose that silenced the domestic anxieties I had carried with me across the continent. I was exhausted most of the time, but it was a productive exhaustion, the kind that leaves no room for dwelling on past hurts or future fears. I was dedicated, perhaps overly so, channeling every ounce of emotional energy I possessed into my service. I needed to succeed. Failure was not an option, both for my career and for the promise I had made to Grandma Eleanor. My connection to home was reduced to fragile threads, intermittent satellite calls, and the precious, tangible comfort of letters. The calls with my father and Carol were always the most jarring intrusion into my disciplined life. They felt less like family check-ins and more like mandated professional communications. When the ship was in port and I managed to secure a coveted slot for a video call, Carol was invariably the gatekeeper. Her face, framed perfectly in the screen's light, always held the same brittle smile. "Hello, Sarah," she'd chirp, her voice too loud, too cheerful, masking an underlying impatience. "How are things? Are you staying safe?" I would offer a brief, sanitized report. Everything was fine, duty was challenging, I missed them. But Carol was never truly listening. She would cut me off mid-sentence, her focus zeroing in on a single recurring topic. "The allotment check," she'd state, not ask. "Did you remember to update the direct deposit information? It's crucial we keep everything organized on this end, you know. Managing the household finances is a full-time job." I felt a cold wave wash over me every time she brought up the money. It was transactional. My well-being was secondary to my financial contribution. She never asked about the heat, the stress, or the fear. She only cared about the leverage my Navy salary gave her. I would assure her the paperwork was complete, and within minutes, the call would be over, usually concluding with Carol claiming she had to rush off to a golf lesson or a committee meeting. She never once suggested I speak to Eleanor. It was Eleanor's letters that truly kept me grounded. I cherished them. The thick, slightly textured paper, the familiar, looping script, the faint scent of lavender that somehow survived the journey across oceans and continents. In the beginning, they were long, vibrant narratives. She detailed the ridiculous antics of Mr. Henderson's poodle next door, the aggressive growth of the hydrangeas she insisted on planting every spring, and the latest gossip from her bridge club. She always ended with encouragement, reminding me to eat well and to be proud of the woman I was becoming. I kept these letters bundled neatly in my locker, a small, soft anchor in a world of harsh steel. But then, slowly, Insidiously, the tone began to change. The first hint of trouble came 6 months into my deployment. Her handwriting seemed tighter, less flowing. The details of neighborhood life started to fade, replaced by vague generalities. I noticed she stopped mentioning her Sunday visits to the main house, the tradition that had been inviolable for decades, the weekly family dinner where Eleanor had always presided over the table, regardless of Carol's thinly veiled irritation. I wrote back immediately, asking if she was feeling unwell. Her reply was carefully worded, almost evasive. "I'm perfectly fine, dear heart," she wrote. "I've just found that I need a bit more quiet these days. Your father and Carol have been very understanding about my need for independence. We are simply setting new boundaries for the family dynamic." The phrase "new boundaries" hit me like a physical blow. I knew exactly whose boundaries those were. Carol had always resented Eleanor's presence, viewing her as an interfering entity and a constant reminder that she was the second wife. I pictured Carol delivering that phrase with a saccharine smile and the absolute certainty of a general issuing a battle plan. It wasn't about independence. It was about exclusion. The letters continued to shrink. They became hesitant, almost like she was writing under surveillance. She would vaguely reference Dad needing quiet time, or the house being so busy lately. But she's napping, or she's out shopping, or she's just having a quiet day. You need to focus on your deployment, Sarah. Don't worry about us domestic issues. We have everything under control here. The last phrase, "we have everything under control here," was a chilling declaration of victory. I was trapped by my duty, haunted by the knowledge that my grandmother was being systematically erased from the family circle while I served my country. One letter arrived that solidified my fears into cold, hard certainty. It was the shortest one yet. There was no mention of neighbors or weather, just a single heartbreaking line tucked near the signature. "I miss seeing the garden, dear. I miss your father's silly jokes, the ones he only tells when Carol isn't listening." She missed seeing the garden she had tended for 30 years, the one that abutted the main house where she lived for half her life. This meant she wasn't just skipping Sunday dinner, she was being kept away from the property entirely. She was effectively banished. A controlled, white-hot fury began to simmer beneath the surface of my military discipline. I went through my daily routine, the drills, the maintenance, the watches, with a new, intense focus. But the image of Eleanor isolated and lonely was a constant, sharp pain. I felt a desperate need to tear through the thousands of miles of ocean separating us, to confront Carol and demand she cease her cruelty. But I couldn't. I was bound by my oath, by the commitment I had made to the Navy and to myself. I had to finish my term. I had to earn my discharge honorably. Every day was a calculation. How many more weeks until I could get leave? How many more months until my final discharge? I wrote back to Eleanor, long, detailed letters about the vastness of the Pacific, the beauty of the stars at sea, and the camaraderie I had found. I poured my love and support onto the page, praying that my weekly letters would be enough to keep the light burning for both of us. The distance was my freedom, but it was also my greatest vulnerability. I had worn my uniform as armor, but I realized too late that I had left my true anchor unprotected. The anxiety began to settle in my chest, heavy and constant, like a low-grade fever I couldn't shake. I was dedicated to my service, but a part of me was already fighting a battle I couldn't see, a battle Carol was waging back home. The only thing keeping me sane was the resolute certainty that my service would end, and when it did, my first and most important mission would be to make things right for Eleanor. I just prayed I wouldn't be too late. The crisp Ohio air, heavy with the scent of late August grass and exhaust fumes, hit me the moment I stepped off the plane. It was a familiar smell, yet now it carried a new, unsettling weight. My Navy uniform, starched and pressed, felt like a costume in this civilian setting. I hadn't been home for nearly 18 months, and the anticipation of seeing Eleanor had been the sole fuel powering me through endless watches and grueling exercises overseas. I scanned the small crowd waiting near baggage claim, my eyes searching for the familiar flash of silver hair and the comforting sight of her lavender cardigan. She wasn't there. A knot immediately tightened in my chest. Eleanor was always early. Always. She believed tardiness was a moral failing. My father was waiting near the exit, looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slightly slumped. He managed a weak smile, but the warmth I craved was absent from his eyes. I hugged him, the embrace feeling strangely brittle. "Where's Grandma?" I asked immediately, pulling back. He avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the large duffel bag I was dragging. "Oh, Sarah! Good to see you. Carol is waiting at the house." "I know, Dad, but Eleanor. Did she not want to come?" He shuffled his feet. "She's busy. She's been keeping to herself lately. We'll see her later, all right? Let's just get you settled." The evasiveness was a massive, clanging alarm bell. I knew my father. He wasn't a liar, but he was easily managed, especially by Carol. I let him lead me to the car, but the joy of being home had evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that settled deep in my stomach. The drive to the house was silent. I tried to make small talk about the base, about the ship, but my father offered only monosyllabic responses. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked immaculate, almost aggressively perfect. Carol's influence was everywhere: the freshly painted trim, the meticulously edged lawn, the utter lack of any comforting clutter. It looked less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled Suburban Perfection. Carol met me at the door, her smile wide and artificial, like a poorly executed mask. She was dressed impeccably, her hair flawlessly styled. "Sarah, look at you, all grown up and so navy," she chirped, giving me a brief air kiss near my cheek that didn't actually touch skin. "The uniform suits you, dear. Very disciplined." "Where is Eleanor, Carol?" I repeated, my voice flat. I didn't want the polite small talk. I wanted answers. Carol's smile didn't waver, but her eyes, always cold, hardened slightly. "Well, she's not here, obviously. She's finally settled into her own place. It's for the best, really. She needed independence, and honestly, your father and I needed our space. The house was getting a bit crowded." Crowded. Eleanor had lived in that house for 30 years, long before Carol entered the picture. She had occupied the small, sunlit guest suite, contributing to the household, cooking Sunday dinners, and providing the only real emotional stability I had ever known there. "Her own place? You mean you kicked her out?" I didn't phrase it as a question. My father winced, but Carol merely tilted her head, maintaining her unnerving composure. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. She wasn't kicked out. We simply encouraged her to find accommodations better suited to her needs. She's perfectly happy. I want her address. Now." The tension in the pristine hallway was thick enough to choke on. Carol sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a petulant child. "Honestly, the moment you walk through the door, it's always drama. She's across town. I'll write it down later. Just relax, have a shower, and enjoy your leave." I didn't relax. I didn't unpack. I felt the familiar cold fury that had been suppressed by military discipline boiling to the surface. I knew, with absolute certainty, that Carol had used my deployment, my duty to my country, as the perfect shield to orchestrate this banishment. While I was focused on navigation charts and missile drills, she was systematically dismantling the only safe harbor I had back home. I insisted on the address until my father, looking defeated, finally scribbled it on a napkin while Carol was distracted by a phone call in the kitchen. He pressed the napkin into my hand, his eyes silently pleading for me not to make a scene. I grabbed my car keys and walked out, leaving my bags untouched on the floor. The drive across town was a depressing geography lesson in social hierarchy. I left the manicured, affluent streets of our suburb and drove into a neighborhood where the paint was peeling, the lawns were patchy, and the apartment complexes looked weary and neglected. The address led me to a sprawling, ugly brick building that smelled faintly of stale cooking oil and cleaning chemicals. I found the unit number and knocked. The sound felt loud and intrusive in the quiet hallway. The door opened slowly. The woman standing before me was Eleanor, but she was a diminished version of the grandmother I had last seen hugging me goodbye on the porch. She looked frail, smaller, and utterly exhausted. Her familiar sparkle was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness around her eyes. Her favorite cardigan was threadbare, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the doorframe. "Sarah?" she whispered, her voice choked with surprise and relief. The sight of her living there, in that cramped, sunless space, after decades of pouring her love and stability into our family home, was a physical blow. The rage I had felt earlier transformed into a sharp, agonizing pain. I felt a crushing guilt for not having known, for having trusted my father to protect her, for being thousands of miles away. I didn't say anything. I just pulled her into a tight hug, the scent of lavender replaced by the fainter metallic smell of old buildings. I held her for a long time, rocking her slightly, feeling the sharp points of her shoulders under my hands. "Grandma, I am so sorry," I murmured against her hair. "I didn't know it was this bad." She pulled back, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, honey, don't apologize. You had your duty. Come in, come in." I stepped into the apartment, and the reality of her banishment hit me with full force. It was a single-bedroom unit, cluttered because she had nowhere to put her belongings. The furniture was cheap and mismatched. The windows faced a brick wall, offering no natural light. The air felt heavy and stagnant. Her cherished antique writing desk, the one where she had taught me to balance my first checkbook, was squeezed against the kitchen counter, its mahogany surface dulled by dust. "It's cozy," she said, trying valiantly to sound cheerful, but the lie was painful. "It's awful, Grandma. It's shameful," I corrected, my voice tight. "Why didn't you tell me the truth in your letters?" "I didn't want to worry you, dear. You had important work, and I know how much Carol resents conflict. I just thought it was easier this way. Less drama." Her words echoed Carol's, but where Carol's were a weapon, Eleanor's were a shield, a desperate attempt to maintain peace at the cost of her own comfort and dignity. She told me how Carol had slowly started restricting her access to the main house, first the garden, then the kitchen, then suggesting that her constant presence was stressing my father. Eventually, Carol had simply presented her with apartment listings and a tight deadline, claiming the guest suite was needed for storage. My father hadn't intervened. He had merely looked away. I spent an hour with her, helping her organize a few boxes, but my mind was already racing, plotting my return to the main house. I couldn't stay here, comforting her, while the architect of her misery sat sipping tea in my childhood home. "I have to go back," I announced, standing up. My resolve was ironclad. "I need to talk to them." Eleanor grabbed my arm, fear momentarily replacing the sadness in her eyes. "Sarah, please, don't. It won't help. It will only make things worse for your father." "I don't care," I said, gently pulling free. "I don't care about making things worse for him. I care about the fact that you, the only person who ever truly cared about me in that house, are living like this. I have to say what needs to be said." I kissed her forehead, promising to return immediately. The drive back felt shorter, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and righteous anger. My military training had taught me discipline and focus. Now, I was channeling that laser focus into a personal mission of retribution. I didn't bother using my key this time. I pounded on the front door, the loud, unprofessional noise a deliberate violation of the house's suffocating silence. Carol opened the door, her eyebrows arching slightly in annoyance. She was still in the same perfectly tailored outfit, still holding a delicate ceramic mug. The contrast between her pristine environment and Eleanor's dusty apartment was a visual indictment. "My goodness, Sarah. What is wrong with you? Don't track dirt into the entryway," she admonished. I ignored her, stepping past her into the kitchen, the heart of her domestic control. My father was sitting at the breakfast bar, reading the newspaper, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. "Don't move, Dad," I commanded, my voice low and dangerously steady. I turned to Carol. "I just came from Eleanor's apartment." Carol placed her mug down on the granite counter with a precise, controlled clink. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms. She looked bored. And? I told you she was settled. Did you think she was living in a cardboard box? She's living in a miserable, suffocating hole across town because you decided she was inconvenient. I spat, my voice rising. She is frail, she is lonely, and she is clearly suffering. And you know what? You look pleased about it. Carol let out a delicate, manufactured laugh. Sarah, your melodrama is exhausting. You've been away too long. You're seeing things through a distorted lens. Eleanor is fine. She's independent. We simply set necessary boundaries, which, frankly, she should have established years ago. Boundaries? You isolated her. You manipulated Dad until he was too weak to stand up to you. You used my deployment as your opportunity to erase her from this family. My father finally lowered his newspaper, his face pale. Sarah, stop yelling. This isn't helping anyone. It's helping me, Dad, because I need to know that she understands exactly what she is. You are cruel, Carol. You are petty and you are greedy. You saw Eleanor not as family, but as an obstacle to your control of this house and Dad's resources. Carol's composure finally cracked, just a fraction. A flash of genuine anger crossed her face before she smoothly locked it down again. Greedy? That old woman had nothing of value, Sarah. She was a burden, a constant presence needing attention and taking up space. And you know what? You are exactly like her. Always causing trouble. Always looking for drama. She pushed off the counter and took a step toward me, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper. You are overreacting. You need to focus on your military career, Sarah. Leave the domestic issues to the adults. That phrase, leave the domestic issues to the adults, was the final dismissing blow. It stripped me of my status, my service, and my moral outrage, reducing me to an angry child stamping her feet. I realized in that moment that confronting her was useless. She was impervious to shame and immune to reason. Her control over the house and over my father was absolute. My fury was impotent against her calculated coldness. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to shatter the nearest expensive vase. Fine, I said, my voice now shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. You win this round, Carol. But I am spending every single minute of my leave with the person who actually needs me. And when I get out of the Navy, I am coming back, and I will make sure Eleanor is taken care of, no matter what it takes. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out, leaving the mausoleum of my childhood home behind. The remaining 13 days of my leave were not spent relaxing or catching up with old friends. They were spent on a mission. I returned to Eleanor's small apartment and started cleaning, stocking, and organizing with the same methodical intensity I used for maintaining the ship's inventory. I cleaned the dusty windows until the meager light they allowed in was maximized. I scrubbed the kitchen until it smelled of lemon instead of stale grease. I drove her to the grocery store, filling her tiny refrigerator with fresh food and essentials. I sat with her for hours, helping her sort through the boxes, listening to the stories she couldn't share in her guarded letters. I realized she hadn't just been isolated. She had been starved of genuine human interaction. We spent one afternoon going through her finances, and I helped her set up direct deposit for her small pension, ensuring she wasn't relying on my father for any administrative tasks that Carol could leverage. I bought her a small, comfortable armchair and placed it by the window, even if the view was just brick. I wanted her to have one small piece of comfort, one anchor in her new, unwillingly minimalist life. The last night of my leave, I sat on the edge of her bed, holding her hand. I have to go back, I said, the words heavy in the quiet room. But this time, I won't lose touch. I'll call you directly, I'll send money, and I will be back for good soon. I promise, Grandma. When I get out, I'm coming home, and we are going to figure out a better situation for you. Maybe Seattle, like you always dreamed of visiting. She squeezed my hand, her eyes watery but holding a glimmer of her old resilience. You are my good girl, Sarah. My anchor. You just focus on finishing your service. I'll be here." Leaving her that second time was far harder than the first. The first time, I was excited about my future. This time, I felt like a deserter, abandoning a post I knew was under siege. As the plane lifted off, taking me back to the rigid structure of deployment, I looked down at the shrinking landscape of Ohio. I knew Carol was celebrating my departure, but she had underestimated me. My leave had not been a vacation, it had been a reconnaissance mission. I left Ohio with a burning vow. I would finish my obligation, and then I would return, not just to rescue Eleanor, but to settle the score. I just prayed every night that I wouldn't be too late. The call came in the middle of a routine maintenance check, 3 months shy of my final discharge date. I remember the static cutting in and out over the secure line, the frantic, high-pitched voice of my father sounding distant and broken. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The instant I heard the shaky catch in his throat, I knew the unimaginable had happened. Eleanor was gone. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the cold metal of the bulkheads pressing against my back, while my shipmates moved around me, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in my small, insulated universe. The grief was not just sadness. It was a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that never quite released. It was the crushing weight of a promise broken, the solemn vow I had made during my short leave, assuring her I would be back soon, that I would make things right. I hadn't been there. I hadn't held her hand. I hadn't even been able to call her regularly, thanks to Carol's gatekeeping. The guilt was a suffocating blanket, thick and inescapable. The process of securing emergency leave was a blur of paperwork and clipped military efficiency. I traded the rigorous structure of the sea for the jarring chaos of air travel, my uniform now feeling less like armor and more like a shroud. Every mile that brought me closer to Ohio felt like a step deeper into a nightmare. I kept replaying our last conversation, her quiet bravery, the way she had tried to minimize her isolation just so I wouldn't worry while I was deployed. When I finally landed back in Ohio, the suburban landscape looked offensively normal. The manicured lawns, the familiar, suffocating humidity. But the silence in my father's house was profound. Eleanor's absence was a gaping hole. I walked into the kitchen, expecting the scent of lavender or the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea, but found only the sterile, expensive scent of Carol's preferred cleaning products. My father met me at the door. He looked smaller, older, utterly defeated. His grief seemed genuine, but it was muted, overshadowed by a deep, weary exhaustion. He hugged me loosely, his eyes avoiding mine. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't fought for her, why he had allowed Carol to banish his own mother, but the words stuck in my throat. He was already drowning in his own regret, and I knew any accusation would only push him further away. Then there was Carol. She was already dressed in what I privately termed her widow's chic, a perfectly tailored, expensive black dress that screamed calculated respectability. Her hair was immaculate, her makeup flawless. She approached me with a practiced sigh, offering a hug that was stiff and entirely performative. "Sarah, darling," she whispered, her voice layered with false sympathy. "We are all devastated. Eleanor was a troubled soul, but we tried our best, didn't we? Especially in her final months." I pulled back instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck bristling. I looked directly into her eyes, searching for even a flicker of genuine sadness, but found only sharp, calculating concern, the concern of a producer making sure her play was running smoothly. "I went to see her apartment, Carol," I said, my voice low and steady, laced with the steel I had honed in the Navy. "The one you forced her into. It wasn't troubled, it was lonely." She dismissed my accusation with a delicate wave of her hand, the gesture so irritatingly condescending it made my jaw clench. Nonsense. She wanted her independence. She was fine. Now let's focus on the memorial. We have to present a united front for the community. A united front. That was Carol's mantra, appearances above all else. I realized then that the funeral wasn't about grieving Eleanor. It was about Carol orchestrating the final public chapter of her control over the family narrative. The wake and the funeral were a torture chamber of hypocrisy. I stood stiffly beside the casket, my dress uniform feeling heavy, watching the parade of distant relatives and neighborhood acquaintances. I noticed Carol's movements, the precise moment she would dab her dry eyes with a tissue, the hushed, sorrowful tones she adopted when speaking to the pastor, the way she leaned on my father for support, subtly guiding him and ensuring he didn't say anything unplanned. Every time she whispered a platitude about loss or how much we loved having her close, I felt a physical nausea rise in my throat. She had systematically isolated Eleanor, cutting off her access to the main house, to her garden, and to her son, and now she was playing the role of the devoted, grieving daughter-in-law. I kept my distance, retreating to a quiet corner where I could simply observe the photographs of Eleanor, her brilliant smile, the kindness in her eyes. It was there that I made a silent vow. I would not let Carol win this final battle. Eleanor deserved dignity, not this spectacle of misplaced emotion. The days between the funeral and the reading of the will were agonizing. I stayed at the house, but I felt like an intruder in my own childhood home, now entirely sanitized and controlled by Carol's taste. She kept dropping hints, subtly discussing the liquidation of assets and managing the estate's affairs. She clearly assumed that Eleanor, having been banished and living in a modest apartment, had only minimal savings and perhaps a few pieces of antique furniture. I watched her, studying her greed like a tactical problem. Her expectation was palpable. She assumed that whatever paltry estate existed would either be split evenly between my father and me, or, more likely in her mind, my father would inherit it all, placing it immediately under her financial control. She saw the will reading not as a moment of final closure, but as a minor acquisition phase. The morning of the reading was cold and gray. We gathered in the office of Mr. Thompson, Eleanor's longtime, stern-faced lawyer. The room smelled faintly of old paper and leather polish. I sat straight-backed in my chair, the discipline of my service forcing me into a position of outward calm, though my insides were churning. My father sat beside me, looking genuinely miserable. Carol, however, was a picture of contained excitement. She wore a tailored gray suit, a color that suggested professionalism and readiness for business. I could feel the tension radiating off her. She kept smoothing the fabric of her skirt and checking the time, her eyes glittering with poorly concealed avarice. She was ready to claim her spoils, eager to wrap up this messy domestic affair and integrate Eleanor's meager belongings into her own portfolio. I didn't care about the money. Not one bit. I just needed to hear Eleanor's voice one last time, to know that she had known how much I loved her, and that perhaps, in her final act, she had managed to reclaim some of the dignity Carol had tried so hard to strip away. I observed Carol leaning slightly forward, her posture rigid with anticipation, ready to dissect the inventory list. I braced myself, ready for the final bitter disappointment of hearing my grandmother's small life reduced to a footnote of possessions. Mr. Thompson adjusted his spectacles, the sound echoing loudly in the silent room. He picked up the heavy legal folder. I closed my eyes briefly, taking a deep breath, preparing for the final anchor to be lifted, preparing to let go of the woman who had been my only true home in Ohio. I waited, ready for the lawyer to begin the final formal pronouncement of Eleanor's will, unaware that the quiet woman I loved had prepared a detonation that was about to shatter Carol's carefully constructed world. The mahogany table in Mr. Thompson's office was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the anxious tremor in Carol's perfectly manicured hand. I sat stiffly, my dress blues feeling heavy and out of place in the airless room. The only sound, besides the occasional rustle of legal paper, was the faint, rhythmic ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece, a metronome counting down to the final, painful chapter of Eleanor's life. Carol was seated opposite me, radiating a poorly concealed, almost frantic anticipation. Her posture was impeccable, but I could see the feverish glint in her eyes. She had dressed for the occasion, not in mourning, but in expectation. I knew exactly what she was anticipating. A modest, manageable sum, maybe a few pieces of antique silver, which she would quickly liquidate and dismiss as negligible. She assumed this was merely a formality, a final necessary step before she could completely erase Eleanor's physical presence from our family history. My father sat beside her, looking smaller and grayer than I remembered, his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding my eyes entirely. I, on the other hand, felt nothing but a dull, heavy ache. I didn't care about the money. I was just there to receive the last official word from the only person who had ever truly seen me. I kept my attention focused on the heavy, bound document resting on the desk, the final testament of my grandmother's quiet strength. Mr. Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with professional neutrality, cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. The sound was loud in the silence. "We are here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Jane Hartley," he stated, his voice dry and formal. He began with the standard preliminary language, the boilerplate legal phrasing that felt utterly inadequate to describe the legacy of the woman we had lost. Carol kept interrupting him with small, impatient sighs, shifting her weight, clearly urging him to get to the financial details. The first bequests were small, sentimental items. A locket went to a distant cousin. A small savings bond was earmarked for the local library. Then, Mr. Thompson reached the main body of the estate. "Regarding the primary assets and remaining property," he read, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more deliberate. Carol leaned forward, her mouth set in a predatory half-smile. I braced myself, expecting him to name my father, or perhaps divide things equally between us, which Carol would undoubtedly view as her eventual control. "To my beloved granddaughter, Sarah Jane Hartley," Mr. Thompson began, looking up to ensure he had my attention. I nodded, meeting his gaze. The next words hit the room with the force of a sonic boom. "I leave my entire residual estate, including all savings, personal property, and the commercial real estate located in downtown Seattle, Washington." The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, a sudden, terrifying cessation of reality. Seattle. Commercial real estate. I stared blankly. My mind struggled to reconcile the gentle, lavender-scented woman who baked cookies in suburban Ohio with the owner of a substantial, income-generating asset thousands of miles away. It made no sense. I had never heard a whisper of Seattle property. Mr. Thompson continued, reading the crucial legal language that confirmed my sole beneficiary status. Then he read the specific, personal clause Eleanor had insisted on, the heart of her final message. He lowered the document slightly, looking directly at Carol, though the words were meant for all of us. "I leave this inheritance solely to Sarah, whose dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering love she showed me, even when others chose to isolate and abandon me in my time of need. This is a testament to true loyalty." The impact of those words was absolute. It was not just a legal distribution, it was a public declaration, a posthumous judgment delivered with surgical precision. Eleanor hadn't just left me money, she had left me validation. She had seen Carol's cruelty, my father's weakness, and my own helplessness from thousands of miles away, and she had waited patiently to execute the perfect, devastating act of justice. Carol erupted. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the years of passive aggression and calculated dismissiveness, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "This is ridiculous! It's impossible!" she shrieked, slamming her hand down on the polished table. The sound echoed painfully. "She was senile. She was manipulated. You, Sarah, you worked this. You were calling her, poisoning her against us while you were overseas. She wouldn't have done this." Her face was contorted with a fury so raw and ugly that even my father flinched. The avarice that had been glittering in her eyes moments before was now a burning, consuming rage. The idea that the wealth she had coveted, the wealth she had assumed would eventually trickle into her control through my father, was now entirely mine. gifted by the woman she had systematically banished, was unbearable to her. Mrs. Hartley was of sound mind when she executed this will, Carol, Mr. Thompson stated calmly, pushing his glasses up his nose. I personally oversaw the psychiatric evaluation. Furthermore, the clause regarding isolation and abandonment was added specifically by her to address the circumstances of her final year. The documentation is ironclad. Carol turned her attack on my father. Did you know about this? Did you allow this old woman to insult us like this? After everything we did for her? My father, who had been silent and withdrawn for years, finally moved. He didn't speak a word, but he slowly, deliberately placed his large, trembling hand on Carol's arm, a gesture of restraint rather than comfort. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes. Even he, the man blinded by comfort and controlled by his wife, recognized the finality of the situation. He recognized the truth in Eleanor's words. I sat there, feeling a strange, cold calm descend upon me. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to speak. Eleanor had spoken for me. I looked at Carol, whose face was now slick with tears of pure, frustrated greed, and I felt nothing but profound pity for her emptiness. She had sacrificed family, kindness, and decency for financial gain, only to be utterly and publicly defeated by the very person she had tried to erase. Mr. Thompson, I said quietly, finding my voice, which sounded steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. I need time to process this. When can we discuss the transfer of assets and the management of the Seattle property? We can begin immediately, Sarah, he replied, ignoring Carol's continuous, furious sputtering. Perhaps we should reconvene tomorrow, just the two of us. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the hardwood floor. I looked down at my father. His eyes were full of a complicated mixture of sadness, shame, and perhaps a fleeting moment of relief that someone had finally stood up to Carol, even if it was a ghost. I'm leaving now, Dad, I said. He simply nodded, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't acknowledge Carol. I didn't need to. I walked out of that mahogany-paneled room and into the bright Ohio afternoon, leaving the sounds of Carol's impotent rage echoing behind the closed door. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, phone calls with property managers in Washington, and my own official discharge from the Navy. I realized the true magnitude of Eleanor's gift. It wasn't just a comfortable retirement fund. It was absolute independence. It was freedom from the need to ever look back at Ohio, at the shadows of Carol's control, or the disappointment of my father's silence. I chose Seattle. It was the place Eleanor had quietly built a legacy, and it was a city far removed from the suburban constraints of my past. I needed a fresh start, a place where I was Sarah, the Navy veteran and beneficiary, not Sarah, the unwanted stepdaughter. I flew out immediately upon my discharge. Standing on the sidewalk in downtown Seattle, looking up at the multi-story brick building that now belonged to me, I felt an overwhelming sense of awe and responsibility. The air was cool and clean, smelling of salt and damp earth, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating atmosphere of Ohio. I toured the building, met the tenants, and spoke with the property manager. Eleanor had been a meticulous, fair, and incredibly discreet landlord. She had managed this entire enterprise through a small, private trust, ensuring that even her tax filings didn't raise flags back home. She had been preparing for this final act for years, planning my future while I was busy planning my escape. The inheritance was not merely financial, it was a profound act of belief. Eleanor hadn't just given me money, she had given me a foundation, a secure platform from which to launch my new life, free of debt and obligation. She had recognized my character, the resilience forged by years of Navy service and the loyalty she knew I possessed, and she had rewarded it justly. I considered what to do with the funds. I had enough for my own needs, more than enough. Spending it purely on myself felt wrong, a betrayal of the quiet generosity Eleanor embodied. I thought back to those cramped, dusty conditions in her final apartment, the isolation she endured, and the knowledge that so many elderly people, especially veterans and their spouses, struggle silently. My decision crystallized quickly. I used a significant portion of the initial income to establish the Eleanor J. Charitable Fund. Its mission was specific: to provide immediate financial aid and housing support for elderly veterans and their families facing isolation or financial hardship, mirroring the precise circumstances Eleanor had endured. I stood in my new, spacious Seattle apartment, looking out over the Puget Sound, the city lights twinkling below me. I held the last letter Eleanor had managed to send me, the one where she had vaguely mentioned missing the garden. I had kept my promise to her. I had come back. But more importantly, she had kept her silent promise to me. She had ensured that my loyalty was rewarded, and that Carol's greed resulted in utter humiliation. The wealth was immense, yes, but the true treasure was the silence it bought me. The silence of Carol's defeated fury and the quiet, resolute certainty that I was finally free. My grandmother's legacy was not measured in the square footage of a building, but in the enduring power of loyalty and the final perfect act of love that shattered a lifetime of malice. I was now anchored in Seattle, ready to build a life worthy of the woman who had sacrificed her comfort to secure mine.